Billionaires don't just leave fortunes, they leave traps. While my greedy relatives popped champagne over their newly inherited 8-figure corporate empires, I was quietly handed a stained yellow envelope. They thought Grandpa had finally written me out. They didn't realize he had just handed me the detonator to their ruin. The rain lashed against the towering, floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrington estate in Newport, Rhode Island, as if the sky itself was weeping for my grandfather. But inside the sprawling, mahogany-paneled library, there was no real grief to be found. Only the thick, suffocating stench of anticipation. Grandpa Arthur Harrington was a titan. He had built a real estate and shipping empire from absolute scratch, starting with a single rusted cargo boat and ending with a global conglomerate worth billions. He was a ruthless businessman to the world, but to me, he was just Grandpa, the man who taught me how to fish on quiet Sunday mornings, the man who smelled of peppermint and expensive pipe tobacco, and the only person in this family who ever looked at me with genuine warmth. I sat quietly in the corner of the library, sinking into a worn leather wingback chair. Across from me sat the rest of the Harrington bloodline, looking like a casting call for a pretentious soap opera. There was my Uncle Richard, Arthur's eldest son. He was pacing the length of the Persian rug, aggressively checking the diamond-encrusted Rolex on his wrist. Richard had spent his entire life waiting for Grandpa to die so he could officially take over the board of directors. Sitting near him was his wife, Cynthia, whose face was so frozen with Botox that her attempts at looking sorrowful translated into a vaguely confused grimace. Then there was my Aunt Beatrice. She was dabbling at her dry eyes with a black lace handkerchief, draped head to toe in mourning couture that probably cost more than my entire college tuition. Beside her were her twin children, my cousins Chloe and Liam. Chloe was furiously texting on her phone beneath the table, probably pre-ordering a sports car, while Liam was openly yawning, nursing a glass of Grandpa's $200 scotch. And then there was me, Clara, the daughter of Arthur's youngest son, David. My father had been the black sheep of the family. He had rejected the corporate world to become a high school history teacher, a decision that Uncle Richard and Aunt Beatrice constantly mocked him for. When my parents died in a car accident 10 years ago, the family practically threw a party. Only Grandpa Arthur had been there for me, paying for my schooling and making sure I was never truly alone. I didn't care about his empire. I just missed the man. "Can we get this over with?" Uncle Richard snapped, breaking the heavy silence. "The market's open in an hour, and I need to make sure the transition of power is swift to prevent a stock dip." "Have some respect, Richard," Aunt Beatrice murmured, though her eyes were gleaming with the exact same predatory greed. "We are here to honor Father's wishes." At that moment, the heavy oak doors groaned open. Mr. Harrison Sterling, Grandpa's lifelong attorney and closest confidant, stepped into the room. He was a tall, skeletal man with piercing gray eyes that swept over the room with barely concealed disdain. He carried a thick, leather-bound folder. The family instantly snapped to attention, sitting up straight like dogs waiting for a bone. "Thank you all for being here," Mr. Sterling said, his voice a dry, gravelly monotone. He set his briefcase on the grand oak desk and took his seat. Arthur Harrington was a man of specific tastes and precise intentions. His last will and testament was updated merely 2 weeks before his passing. I will read it exactly as he instructed. I felt a lump form in my throat. Hearing Mr. Sterling talk about Grandpa in the past tense made it undeniably real. He was gone. Sterling adjusted his reading glasses and opened the heavy folder. "I, Arthur Winston Harrington, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament, revoking all prior wills." The boilerplate legal jargon dragged on for what felt like hours, but the family leaned in closer with every passing word, salivating. Finally, Sterling reached the distribution of assets. "To my eldest son, Richard Harrington," Sterling read, his voice echoing in the dead-silent room. "I leave my controlling shares in Harrington Global Shipping, as well as the sum of $45 million in liquid capital." Richard exhaled a sharp breath, a triumphant smirk spreading across his face. He leaned back, crossing his arms like a king who had just claimed his throne. "To my daughter, Beatrice Harrington," Sterling continued, "I leave the entire portfolio of European real estate, the London townhouse, and the sum of $38 million. Beatrice let out a delicate, theatrical gasp, clutching her pearls. Oh, Father, how generous. To my grandchildren, Chloe and Liam, the lawyer droned on. I leave the vintage automotive collection, the offshore trust accounts, and a lump sum of $15 million each. Chloe actually squealed, "Oh my God, Liam, I'm buying the villa in Tuscany," she whispered loudly. Liam just smirked and took another sip of his scotch. I sat frozen. The numbers being thrown around were staggering. I knew Grandpa was wealthy, but the sheer volume of cash they were inheriting was unfathomable. Yet, as the list went on, an icy dread began to settle in my stomach. The family had gotten exactly what they wanted. They were all set for life, elevated to a level of untouchable wealth. Mr. Sterling paused. He turned the page, and the room fell silent once more. There was only one heir left. And finally, Sterling said, his eyes flicking up from the paper to look directly at me. The warmth in his gray eyes was unmistakable. To my granddaughter, Clara Harrington. Everyone in the room turned to look at me. Uncle Richard's smirk vanished, replaced by a deep scowl. Beatrice narrowed her eyes. They had always hated that I was Grandpa's favorite. They were terrified he was going to leave me the lion's share of the empire out of guilt for my father's death. "I leave my sincerest apologies," Sterling read softly. My heart stopped. "I leave Clara no capital, no real estate, and no shares in Harrington Global," Sterling finished. The silence that followed was deafening. And then a cruel, sharp laugh sliced through the room. It was Uncle Richard. "Well," Richard chuckled, shaking his head. "I suppose the old man finally realized that giving money to David's kid would be throwing it down the drain. You're lucky he paid for your useless liberal arts degree, Clara." Aunt Beatrice smiled, a sickly sweet expression of fake pity. "Now, Richard, don't be cruel. Clara, dear, I'm sure you can find a nice little job somewhere. We might even have an opening in the mailroom at the corporate office." I couldn't breathe. It wasn't the money. I had never asked Grandpa for a dime, and I fully expected to walk away with nothing but memories. But the public humiliation, the idea that he had specifically written me out with an apology, it felt like a slap to the face. It felt like a betrayal. Tears pricked my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I would not give them the satisfaction. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice trembling slightly, Is that all?" Sterling closed the thick leather binder. He looked at Richard, then at Beatrice, and finally back to me. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled something out, sliding it across the polished oak table. "Not quite, Clara," Sterling said quietly. "He left you this." There, sitting on the gleaming wood, was a small, battered yellow envelope. The laughter in the room instantly died down, replaced by a tense, suspicious silence. "What is that?" Uncle Richard demanded, stepping toward the table. "A secret trust? A hidden account?" "Harrison, if my father has squirreled away company funds—" "It is exactly what it looks like, Richard," Mr. Sterling interrupted, his voice like cracking ice. "A personal effect, excluded from the corporate ledger. It belongs solely to Clara." I stood up, my legs feeling like lead, and walked over to the desk. The family watched me like hawks, their eyes burning holes into the side of my head. I reached out and picked up the envelope. It was surprisingly heavy, made of thick, aged manila paper. It felt brittle under my fingertips, and the flap was sealed with thick red wax bearing Grandpa's personal signet ring crest. "Open it," Chloe demanded, her voice shrill. "What if it's the deed to the Manhattan penthouse? He wouldn't just give her an envelope." "It is a private communication," Mr. Sterling said sternly. "Clara is under no obligation to open it here." I looked down at the yellow paper. It smelled faintly of his pipe tobacco. My chest tightened. I didn't want to open it here, surrounded by these grinning, greedy jackals. "I'm leaving," I said quietly. "Oh, let her go," Uncle Richard scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. "It's probably just a sappy letter about her deadbeat dad. We have real business to attend to. Sterling, I need you to authorize the transfer of the holding company immediately." I didn't look back. I clutched the yellow envelope to my chest and practically ran out of the library, the sound of my family's joyful, greedy chatter echoing behind me. I pushed through the heavy front doors of the estate and stepped out into the pouring rain. By the time I reached my rusted 2008 Honda Civic, parked at the edge of the sprawling driveway, I was soaked to the bone. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The sound of the rain drumming against the metal roof was the only thing keeping me grounded. My hands were shaking violently as I stared at the envelope. No capital, no real estate, no shares. Just this. I took a deep breath, broke the red wax seal with my thumb, and carefully tore the top open. I tipped it upside down over my lap. Two things fell out. The first was a heavy, antique iron key. It was completely rusted, primitive-looking, and had the number 704 stamped into the metal handle. The second was a letter. It wasn't typed by a legal assistant. It was handwritten on Grandpa's thick, personalized stationery. The handwriting was shaky, clearly written in the final, agonizing weeks of his illness. I unfolded the thick paper, my eyes scanning the sprawling cursive. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, I am gone, and the vultures have already begun picking at my bones. I can only imagine the smug look on your Uncle Richard's face as he claims my empire. Let him smile. Let them all smile. Clara, you were the only one who ever asked how I was doing, instead of asking what I was leaving behind. You have your father's heart. David was a good man, too good for the family he was born into. I failed him. But I refuse to fail you. I know right now you are feeling humiliated. I know my words at the reading sounded cruel. But you must understand the millions I gave to Richard, Beatrice, and the others. It is not a blessing, it is a curse. The fortune they think they just inherited is an illusion, a house of cards rotting from the inside out. Harrington Global is not what it seems. They are inheriting a ghost. I have spent the last 3 years watching them plot against me. I have watched them circle me like predators. So, I gave them exactly what they asked for. I gave them the crown, knowing the guillotine was already falling. But you, Clara, you deserve the truth. You deserve my actual legacy. The real fortune is not on paper, and it is not in the banks. I hid it away, far from the greedy eyes of your uncle and the corporate auditors. This key unlocks the truth. It unlocks everything. Go to the old iron foundry in the industrial district of Providence. The property was supposed to be demolished 20 years ago, but I kept the lease under a dummy corporation. Go to the basement level. Find the door. Do not tell anyone. Do not trust Mr. Sterling with this. Do not trust the police. Trust only yourself. I love you, my sweet girl. Now, go take back what is ours. With all my love, Grandpa Arthur. I sat in the cold, damp car, staring at the letter until the words blurred into a tearful mess. My mind was racing. A house of cards? Inheriting a ghost? I looked down at the heavy iron key resting against my jeans. Suddenly, the yellow envelope didn't feel like a slight. It felt like a loaded weapon. Grandpa had played them all. He had set a trap for his own children, and he had given me the only way out. I wiped my eyes with the back of my sleeve, suddenly feeling a surge of adrenaline cut through my grief. I shoved the letter into the glove compartment, gripped the steering wheel, and turned the key in the ignition. The old engine sputtered and roared to life. I threw the car into drive and sped down the long, winding driveway of the Harrington estate, leaving my uncle and aunt to pop their expensive champagne. They thought they had won. They thought they were the masters of the universe. I merged onto the highway, heading straight for the rotting industrial district of Providence. The rain was coming down harder now, washing away the world I used to know. The old iron foundry was a place my father had mentioned once or twice, a derelict relic from the early 1900s, long abandoned by the city. It took me 40 minutes to reach the district. It was a desolate wasteland of crumbling brick smokestacks, shattered windows, and overgrown weeds. I parked the Civic down a cracked alleyway, the headlights illuminating the rusted metal gates of the old foundry. I grabbed my flashlight from the back seat, tucked the iron key into my jacket pocket, and stepped out into the storm. The wind howled through the skeletal remains of the factory. I slipped through a gap in the chain-link fence, my boots squelching in the mud, until I found a heavy, reinforced steel door around the back of the main building. It looked out of place among the decaying brick. It looked new. I descended a flight of slippery concrete stairs into the darkness of the basement well. At the bottom, there was a heavy iron door embedded into the stone foundation. There was no handle, just a single heavy keyhole. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I pulled the rusted key from my pocket. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped it once, the metal clanging loudly against the concrete. I picked it up, took a deep breath, and slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. I turned it. A heavy mechanical clack echoed through the stairwell. I pushed my weight against the cold iron door, and with a terrible groan it swung inward, revealing pitch-black darkness. I clicked on my flashlight, stepping over the threshold into the secret room. And as the beam of light swept across the cavernous space, my jaw dropped. Grandpa was right. The millions they inherited meant nothing, because what was hidden down here changed everything. The heavy iron door groaned shut behind me, sealing me inside a space that felt entirely disconnected from the decaying world above. The air down here was different, dry, temperature-controlled, and smelling faintly of ozone and hot dust. I swept my flashlight beam across the pitch-black void, my breath catching in my throat as the shadows retreated to reveal Grandpa Arthur's ultimate secret. It wasn't a dungeon, and it wasn't a storage closet. It was a fully operational subterranean command center. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling metal filing cabinets. In the center of the room sat a massive vintage Mosler bank safe, its brushed steel surface gleaming dully in the flashlight beam. To the right, a long industrial table held an array of modern computer servers, their green and blue LED lights blinking rhythmically, casting an eerie glow over the concrete walls. It was a staggering juxtaposition. A high-tech nerve center hidden beneath a rotting, century-old iron foundry. I walked toward the center table, my boots clicking sharply against the epoxy floor. Resting on the desk beside the server rack was a battery-powered camping lantern and a thick, black leather ledger. I flicked on the lantern, flooding the immediate area with harsh white light, and set my flashlight down. My hands trembled as I opened the black ledger. The first page bore a single, handwritten title in Grandpa's unmistakable cursive, The Sins of Harrington Global. I began to read, and with every page I turned, the blood drained further from my face. Grandpa hadn't just left Uncle Richard and Aunt Beatrice a company, he had left them a ticking time bomb. According to the meticulous notes, bank statements, and internal audit reports pasted into the ledger, Harrington Global Shipping was catastrophically bankrupt. For the last 6 years, Richard had been secretly leveraging the company's physical assets, the cargo ships, the warehouses, the international ports to secure massive, high-interest loans from unregulated offshore lenders. He had been funneling that cash into dummy corporations in the Cayman Islands, funding a lavish lifestyle and a series of disastrously failed luxury real estate ventures. Beatrice was in on it too. Her pristine European real estate portfolio, it was heavily mortgaged, propped up by falsified revenue reports, generated by an accountant she had bribed at Deloitte. They thought Grandpa didn't know. They thought the old man was losing his grip, spending his final years oblivious in his Newport estate. But Arthur Harrington had known everything. Instead of confronting them and destroying the company's public stock, he had quietly engaged a team of private forensic accountants. He let Richard and Beatrice dig their own graves, documenting every wire fraud, every forged signature, and every shell company. They wanted the empire so badly, Clara, a final note in the ledger read. So, I gave it to them. The corporate debt currently stands at $1.4 billion. The SEC and the Department of Justice have been anonymously receiving this exact evidence for the past 6 months. The indictments are already sealed. When Richard officially assumes the role of CEO, he assumes all legal liability. He is stepping onto a sinking ship, and he has just handcuffed himself to the steering wheel. I gasped, stumbling backward until my hip hit the cold steel of the Mosler safe. The millions they had inherited at the will reading were entirely fabricated liquid capital that Richard would legally have to burn through in a desperate, futile attempt to appease the federal auditors once the freeze hit. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the dark corner of the room. Click. I whipped around, grabbing my flashlight and pointing it toward the shadows. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking with panic. A figure stepped out from behind the server racks. It was a man, perhaps in his late 50s, wearing a sharp, tailored charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place in a damp basement. He held his hands up in a placating gesture. "Peace, Clara," Please, the man said, his voice calm and gravelly. My name is Thomas Gallagher. I was your grandfather's private wealth manager at Vanguard, the real one, not the corporate lapdogs Richard uses. How do you know my name? I backed up, clutching the heavy iron key in my fist like a weapon. How did you get down here? I have been down here for 3 hours, waiting for you, Gallagher replied softly, stepping into the light of the lantern. Arthur told me that if anything happened to him, I was to wait in the foundry. He said you would come. He said you were the only one who wouldn't just throw a yellow envelope in the trash. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. You knew about all this? The fraud, the debt? I helped him uncover it, Gallagher nodded, a grim smile touching his lips. Your grandfather was heartbroken when he realized what his eldest children were doing. But he was a pragmatist. He knew Harrington Global was dead the moment Richard signed those fraudulent loan agreements. So Arthur spent his last 3 years liquidating his personal, clean assets, the ones entirely disconnected from the corporate umbrella. He sold his private art collection, his personal stock portfolios, and his untraceable patents. Gallagher gestured toward the massive Mosler safe behind me. Your key, Clara. Number 704. I looked down at the rusted iron key, then turned to the safe. There was a secondary, old-fashioned keyhole beneath the heavy combination dial. I slid the key in and turned it. With a heavy metallic thud, the locking mechanism disengaged. Gallagher stepped forward and helped me pull the massive steel door open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash or gold bars. Instead, there was a single, pristine white briefcase. Arthur created the Phoenix Trust, Gallagher explained, as I pulled the briefcase out and popped the latches. It is a fully independent, legally bulletproof holding company registered in Delaware. It contains $75 million in clean, tax-paid treasury bonds, the deeds to 12 debt-free commercial properties across the Midwest, and a controlling stake in a highly profitable green energy startup. I opened the briefcase. Stacks of certified documents, bearer bonds, and a pristine platinum bank card stared back at me. And the sole beneficiary? I whispered, though I already knew the answer. You, Clara, Gallagher smiled gently. Your uncle inherited a ghost. You inherited the future. 3 weeks later, the Harrington family was on top of the world, or so they thought. Uncle Richard wasted no time cementing his newly acquired power. He immediately fired Mr. Sen to Calabai Kalantu. Sterling installed his own cronies on the board of directors and liquidated a portion of his inherited cash to throw the most extravagant corporate gala New York City had seen in a decade. It was officially billed as the Harrington Global Annual Shareholder Gala, held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, but everyone knew it was Richard's coronation. I wasn't invited, of course. But when you are the sole controller of the Phoenix Trust and possess a net worth approaching $80 million, doors tend to open for you. I arrived at the plaza at 8 o'clock, stepping out of a sleek, black-town car hired by Thomas Gallagher, who accompanied me. I wore a floor-length, backless emerald gown, a stark contrast to the cheap, sensible clothes my family was accustomed to seeing me in. As Gallagher and I walked into the glittering, chandelier-lit ballroom, heads turned. Aunt Beatrice was the first to spot me. She was holding a flute of Dom Perignon, dripping in diamonds, chatting with a group of Wall Street executives. Her jaw practically unhinged when she saw me. She marched over, her twin children, Chloe and Liam, trailing behind her like confused ducklings. "Clara?" Beatrice hissed, her eyes darting nervously around the room to see who was watching. "What on earth are you doing here? And how did you afford that dress? Did you take out a payday loan to come beg Richard for a job?" Chloe snickered, adjusting her designer silk wrap. "Honestly, Clara, this is a private event for actual stakeholders. You're embarrassing yourself." "I'm not here for a job, Beatrice," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level, offering her a chilling, polite smile. "I'm just here to pay my respects to the new CEO. I wanted a front row seat." "A front row seat to what?" Liam sneered, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. To the main event, Gallagher stepped in smoothly, checking his silver pocket watch, when it should be starting right about now. Before Beatrice could utter another venomous word, the heavy brass doors of the grand ballroom swung open with a deafening crash. The string quartet in the corner abruptly stopped playing, their bows freezing midair. The low hum of wealthy chatter died instantly. A dozen men and women in dark windbreakers poured into the room. Across their backs, bold yellow letters spelled out three devastating acronyms: FBI and SEC. The crowd parted like the Red Sea as the lead agent, a tall, imposing woman with a grim expression, marched straight toward the stage where Uncle Richard had been preparing to give his keynote speech. "Richard Harrington?" The agent's voice boomed over the stunned silence of the ballroom. Richard froze, his smug, practiced smile melting off his face. "Yes? Excuse me, what is the meaning of this? This is a private corporate function." "Richard Harrington, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act," the agent announced, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from her belt. "We have simultaneous raids executing at the Harrington Global Headquarters and your private residences in Newport and Manhattan." The ballroom erupted into sheer, unadulterated chaos. Wall Street executives began rapidly backing away from the stage, pulling out their phones to frantically call their brokers. "This is absurd!" Richard roared, his face turning a violent shade of magenta as two agents forcefully grabbed his arms and spun him around. "I am a billionaire. I just inherited this company. You have no right call my lawyers. Cynthia, call the lawyers." "Your corporate accounts have been frozen by federal order, Mr. Harrington," the lead agent stated coldly, securing the cuffs around his wrists, "including the $45 million transferred into your personal accounts 3 weeks ago. It is all considered stolen collateral." Beside me, Aunt Beatrice dropped her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the marble floor. "Frozen?" Beatrice shrieked, her hands flying to her heavily Botoxed face. "No, no, no! My real estate, the London townhouse." "Aunt Beatrice," I said softly. She whipped her head around to look at me, absolute terror wide in her eyes. Chloe and Liam were frozen, looking like deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. "Grandpa knew," I whispered, stepping closer to her so only she could hear over the screams and shouts of the ballroom. "He knew about the offshore loans. He knew about the fake revenue reports. He knew you and Richard were bleeding the company dry." Beatrice choked on a sob, her knees buckling slightly. Arthur set us up." "No," I corrected her, my voice hard and entirely devoid of pity. "You set yourselves up. Grandpa just finally stopped protecting you from the consequences. He gave you exactly what you wanted." I watched as Uncle Richard was frog-marched through the center of the ballroom, his expensive tuxedo rumpled, his face pale with the sudden, crushing realization that his life was over. As he passed by me, his wild eyes locked onto mine. He saw the emerald dress. He saw the calm, collected look on my face. And in that split second, I saw the exact moment Richard understood. He understood what was in the yellow envelope. He understood who had truly inherited the Harrington empire. "Clara!" Richard screamed, thrashing against the federal agents as they dragged him toward the exit. "Clara, please, tell them it was the old man's fault! Clara!" I didn't blink. I didn't flinch. I just watched the heavy brass doors swing shut behind him, sealing his fate. "Come along, Clara," Thomas Gallagher said gently, placing a hand on my shoulder. "The air in here is getting a bit toxic. I believe we have a board meeting for the Phoenix Trust to prepare for tomorrow morning." I looked one last time at Beatrice, who was now sitting on the floor of the Plaza Hotel, weeping hysterically into her hands while Chloe fruitlessly tried to access her frozen bank apps on her phone. "Yes," I said, turning my back on the wreckage of my family. "Let's go build something real." 6 months. That was all it took for a dynasty built over 4 decades to crumble into absolute dust. The collapse of Harrington Global Shipping dominated the financial news cycles for weeks. The media called it the Harrington House of Cards, dedicating hours of primetime television to dissecting the sheer scale of the fraud my family had committed. Uncle Richard never even made it to trial. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence, meticulously compiled by my grandfather and handed over to the feds, his high-priced defense attorneys advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 15 years in a minimum security federal penitentiary in upstate New York. I saw a photograph of him in the Wall Street Journal being escorted into the courthouse. The arrogant, untouchable titan of industry was gone, replaced by an aging, terrified man in a cheap orange jumpsuit. Aunt Beatrice's fate was arguably worse, at least by her own shallow metrics. Because she was technically complicit in the wire fraud, the government seized everything. The London townhouse, the European real estate portfolio, the offshore accounts, it was all liquidated to pay off the massive corporate debts. Stripped of her wealth and her social standing, she was forced to move into a cramped, two-bedroom apartment in Queens. Her precious twins didn't fare much better. Liam, cut off from his endless supply of scotch and trust fund cash, was finally forced to check himself into a state-run rehabilitation facility. Chloe, whose only marketable skill was spending other people's money, was last seen working as a shift supervisor at a mid-tier department store in New Jersey. A profound fall from grace for a girl who once tried to pre-order a Tuscan villa via text message. As for me, I was in Boston, sitting in the sunlit boardroom of Verdant Dynamics, the green energy startup that was the crown jewel of the Phoenix Trust. There were no heavy mahogany panels here. No suffocating oil paintings of scowling ancestors. The walls were glass, looking out over the harbor, and the air hummed with actual, productive energy. I wasn't just sitting on the $75 million Grandpa had left me. Under Thomas Gallagher's meticulous guidance, I was investing it. We were building wind farms off the coast of Maine and developing sustainable shipping logistics, ironically, attempting to clean up the very industry my family had polluted for decades. The quarterly projections are exceeding expectations, Clara, Thomas said, sliding a sleek tablet across the conference table. He looked much more relaxed these days, having traded his stiff charcoal suits for comfortable tweed jackets. The Midwest commercial properties are fully leased, and Verdant's new patent just cleared. Arthur would be incredibly proud. I looked down at the numbers. They were solid. They were real. There was no phantom debt, no cooked books. It was clean. Thank you, Thomas, I smiled, sliding the tablet back. But I need to take the afternoon off. I have one last piece of business to attend to in Rhode Island. Thomas raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Take all the time you need. You're the boss. 2 hours later, I pulled my brand new Volvo SUV up the long, winding driveway of the Newport estate. The towering iron gates, which used to be flanked by private security, were chained shut with a heavy padlock. A massive, glaring white banner from a national bank was strung across the stone pillars. Foreclosed, pending public auction. I parked on the street and slipped through a gap in the hedgerow, walking up the sweeping front lawn. The grass was overgrown, and the grand fountains were completely dry, filled with dead autumn leaves. The house already looked like a ghost ship. I let myself in through the side conservatory door, using a spare key I had kept on my ring since high school. The inside of the house was devastatingly quiet. Most of the expensive furniture, the Persian rugs, and the antique silver had already been seized and cataloged by federal auditors. Bare rectangles of dust marked the walls where priceless paintings used to hang. I walked down the main hall, my footsteps echoing off the marble floors, and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the library. I stopped dead in my tracks. Standing by the grand fireplace, clutching a canvas tote bag, was Aunt Beatrice. She looked a decade older. Without her expensive dermatologists and daily salon blowouts, her hair was a flat, dull gray, and deep stress lines carved through her face. She was frantically shoving a pair of heavy, antique brass candlesticks into her bag. She froze when the door creaked, her eyes darting toward me like a trapped rat. When she realized it was me, the panic in her chest deflated into a bitter, exhausted glare. "What are you doing here, Clara?" she snapped. Though her voice lacked its usual venom, it just sounded tired. "Come to gloat? Come to watch the bank strip the copper wire out of the walls?" "I came to say goodbye to the house," I said quietly, stepping into the room. I looked at the tote bag. Taking those is a federal crime, Beatrice. The bank owns the fixtures now. Beatrice let out a hollow, jagged laugh. "Let them arrest me. At least in federal prison, I wouldn't have to worry about making rent next month." She dropped the tote bag on the floor with a heavy thud. She wrapped her arms around herself, shivering in the drafty, unheated mansion. "You won, Clara. Arthur gave you the golden ticket and handed us the poison. I hope you're happy." "I didn't win anything, Beatrice," I replied, my voice steady. "Grandpa didn't poison you. He just handed you the exact cup you poured for yourselves. You and Richard spent years draining this family dry. He just stopped refilling the well." She looked away, staring into the cold, empty fireplace. She knew I was right. There were no excuses left to make. I walked over to the grand oak desk, the very desk where Mr. Sterling had sat months ago, and handed me that battered yellow envelope. I opened the top drawer. It was mostly empty, save for a few stray paper clips and an old leather-bound journal. It was Grandpa's fishing log, filled with notes on tides, weather patterns, and the exact weights of the striped bass we used to catch on Sunday mornings. It was worthless to the federal auditors. It meant the world to me. I picked it up and held it to my chest. "Goodbye, Beatrice," I said, turning back toward the door. "I hope you and the twins figure out how to survive in the real world." She didn't answer. She just sank into one of the remaining dusty armchairs, burying her face in her hands. I walked out of the library, down the marble hall, and out the front doors of the estate. The afternoon sun was breaking through the heavy coastal clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the overgrown lawn. I didn't look back at the mansion. It was a monument to greed, a mausoleum for a family that had forgotten how to love each other. I got into my car, placed Grandpa's fishing journal on the passenger seat, and drove away from Newport for the final time. I was leaving the Harrington name behind, but I was taking the only piece of Arthur Harrington that truly mattered. The vultures had finally starved. The empire had burned. But from the ashes, I was ready to build a life of my own. In the end, the millions my relatives inherited were nothing but a gilded cage of debt and federal indictments. They fought for a sinking ship, while Grandpa's yellow envelope gave me the only treasure that mattered, the truth and the clean slate to rebuild our family's real legacy. Wealth can be inherited, but integrity must be earned. I finally understood what true wealth really meant.